So in order to start our analysis of poetry, we're going to start with the basics: poetic, structure, and form. The most basic division or unit of a poem is the stanza. Consider it the paragraph of poetry. Within a stanza, there are individual lines which may either be enjambed or end-stopped. Enjambed lines occur when the line's meaning runs over from one line to another. End-stopped lines are exactly what they sound like: lines whose meaning ends at the end of the line. Both of these strategies impact the overall meaning of the poem by altering the structure of the meaning. If a line is enjambed, it prompts the reader to continue thinking about the multiple meanings of words, phrases, or images contained within the lines. If a line is enjambed, it prompts the reader to sit back and consider what was just proposed through the words, phrases, or images that have ended. So, for example, in this section of the poem Latitudes by Yusef Komamunyake, the second line is end-stopped. The poet wants you to consider the implications of what the speaker has just revealed. He's not Ulysses. He's the ruthless half-brother. That means we shouldn't expect what we'd expect from Ulysses. Lines 3 through 6 are enjambed. The poet wants us to consider how the imagery of the night sirens connects and connotes different meanings to both birth and 1,000 blossoms. Sometimes commas can indicate an end-stopped line, and sometimes not. It just depends upon the meaning of the line. In this case, we could consider that the comma at the end of line 7 to be an indication of end-stoppment, because line 8 introduces a new thought about the origin of his name. Lines are also divided in order to create the named forms of the stanza. A couplet is a pair of rhymed lines. A quatrain is a 4-line stanza, a sestet a 6-line stanza, an octave an 8-line stanza. Rarely you'll get a 3-line stanza called tercet, or a 5-line stanza called a quintet, but they really aren't as common as couplets, quatrains, sestets, and octaves. A caesura is an abrupt, strong pause caused by punctuation in the middle of a line. Usually, it's indicated through a strong punctuation mark, such as a period or a dash or a semicolon. But it's meant to make the reader stop and consider what was just written, even though it's not the end of a line. Consider this video as means of an explanation.
The sonnet begins with a valiant struggle with death, calling on all the forces of intellect and drama to vanquish the enemy. But it is ultimately about overcoming the seemingly insuperable barriers separating life, death, and eternal life. In the edition you chose, this profoundly simple meaning is sacrificed to hysterical punctuation. And death, capital D, shall be no more, semicolon. Death, capital D, comma, thou shalt die, exclamation mark. And death shall be no more, comma. Death, thou shalt die. Nothing but a breath, a comma, separates life from life everlasting. Very simple, really. With the original punctuation restored, death is no longer something to act out on the stage with exclamation marks. It is a comma, a pause. In this way, the uncompromising way, one learns something from the poem, wouldn't you say? Life, death, soul, God, past, present, not insuperable barriers, not semicolons, just a comma.
As the professor explains, punctuation is important. It can create meaning just by itself. All poems, no matter the building blocks, fall into one of 3 categories: free verse, blank verse, and formal verse. Free verse is poetry without a regular meter or rhythm or rhyme scheme, or even a stanza structure, like this magnetic poetry. Most modern poetry fits into this category. One form of free verse poetry is called a found poem. A found poem is created by taking words from an existing text and refashioning or reordering them and presenting it as a new text. Thus, you find the meaning of a poem in a different text. In this first example, certain words are taken out of context from a page of The Robber Bridegroom and reused to create a new meaning. She hid behind the woman she wanted to be. Another form of free verse poetry is a concrete poem. A concrete or pattern poem derives its meaning, at least in part, from its shape. In this case, Easter Wings by George Herbert, the sideways shape of the poem helps to emphasize the angel wings nature of Herbert's meaning. Another form of verse poetry are elegies. An elegy is an emotion-filled poem that laments the dead. It's usually narrated in first person, but aside from it mourning the loss of a loved one, that's about the only rule. Stepping up a little bit is blank verse. Blank verse is poetry, and sometimes drama or plays, written in a strict rhythm or meter, but with no set rhyme scheme. The majority of Shakespearean plays are written in blank verse. Many longer poetic works, including Robert Browning's, such as My Last Duchess and Porphyria's Lover, are also written in blank verse. Blank verse is utilized because it closely mimics the structure of natural speech, while still allowing the author to apply an overall structure to the poem. This example shows how blank verse works in a monologue from Christopher Marlowe's play Faustus. In it, we can see that the blank verse isn't always strict, as the first line only has 9 beats, 9 syllables, since the first unstressed syllable has been dropped. Also, the fifth line has 3 stressed syllables in a row to allow emphasis on rise, rise again. However, the majority of the lines have 10 syllables and no rhyme scheme. The majority of what we think of as poetry is formal poetry. That is, poetry with a set rhyme and rhythm pattern. One of the most popular formal poetic structures is the sonnet. Sonnets are defined as 14-line poems written in iambic pentameter. There are 2 styles, English and Italian. English sonnets have 3 sets of quatrains followed by a heroic couplet. A heroic couplet is a pair of rhymed lines that ends a stanza. It's used for effect. In this case, it's used to emphasize Shakespeare's belief that nothing will make his absence from his lover better, even birdsong. English sonnets also tend to have one of 2 different rhyme schemes, either A-B-A-B, as seen here, or A-B-B-A, what's known as an envelope quatrain, but we'll talk about that in a minute. The Italian or Petrarchian sonnet have an octave followed by a sestet. The octave is composed of 2 envelope quatrains, in which the first and fourth lines rhyme, enveloping the second and third lines, which also rhyme. The sestet is more flexible, with pretty much any set pattern of rhyme scheme. All sonnets, whether they are English or Italian Petrarchian, have 2 parts. The first section presents a theme, it raises a question or a doubt. In the Italian or Petrarchian sonnet, this is the entire octave. In the English sonnet, it generally tends to occur somewhere within the first 3 quatrains. In this case, John Donne raises the question of death's power. The second answers the question. It resolves the doubt or it drives home the theme. Donne's argument here is that death really has no power, since after a brief moment of dying, he believed that we all awoke and lived eternally in heaven, where death held no sway, and would therefore die. The volta, or turn, is the point in a sonnet where the thought or argument changes. In English sonnets, it generally occurs around lines 12 or 13, the start of the heroic couplet, but it can occur as early as line 8 or 9 in both English and Italian or Petrarchian sonnets. So, what do we do with poems that have a rhyme scheme but no rhythm or meter? Or what if we have some other unifying factor that isn't a rhyme scheme or rhythm altogether? Technically, these would probably be categorized as free verse poetry, but for our purposes, we're just going to identify them by their specific names. VNLs are one of these gray area forms of poetry. They contain 19 lines set into 6 stanzas, 5 tercets, and a concluding quatrain. There's no set meter, meaning that the number of syllables in each line doesn't have to remain constant. There is, however, a set rhyme scheme. All VNLs use an ABA rhyme scheme for the first 5 tercets. Therefore, night rhymes with light, rhymes with bright, rhymes with flight, and sight and height. And day rhymes with they, bay, way, gay, and pray. They use an ABAA rhyme scheme for the final quatrains. What makes VNLs different, however, is the repetition scheme. The first and third lines alternate throughout. Thus, the first line of the first stanza becomes the third lines of the second, fourth, and sixth stanzas. The third line of the first stanza becomes the third line of the third, fifth, and then the last line of the sixth stanza. This forces the poem to end with a heroic couplet. The Sistina is another set structure form of poetry. It's a 39-line poem divided into 6 sestets and an ending tercet. Normally, it would be laid out in a straight line, but to save space, I've formed it into 2 columns. It has neither a rhyme scheme nor a set rhythm. What it does have, however, is a heck of a repetition pattern. The Sistina repeats the final word of each of the first 6 lines in a specific pattern throughout the rest of the entire poem. The pattern itself is extremely complicated, but what you just need to remember is that the last line of the previous stanza becomes the first line of the next stanza. So, at the end of the first stanza, tears becomes the last line of the first stanza of. So, the last word of the first stanza, tears, becomes the last word of the first line of the second stanza. The 7th stanza is called an envoy. An envoy is a term used for any short ending stanza used to address a specific person. The difference in a sestina is that it uses all 6 repeating words, 2 per line, to again emphasize the message and meaning of the poem as a whole. The ballad is the last ambiguous poetic structure we're going to look at today. A ballad is a poem that's written in a narrative style, meaning it tells a story. It has quatrains with a rhymed A-B-C-B pattern, and it frequently contains refrains or repeated lines throughout the poem. Ballads tend to be longer and are characterized by a swift action and a direct storytelling. So, now that you know the basic forms and structures, we're going to look at some specific poems in class.